If you would, go ahead and open to Luke and chapter 15 and the parable of the Prodigal Son. This is one of the most recognized and familiar parables that Jesus taught, and for me, one of the most amazing. Over the last week, I spent hours with this parable, digging deeper and deeper and keep digging, and I never hit bedrock, such as its depth. And if you were to ask me who the parable is about, the young son, the father, or the older son, I would answer yes, such as its breadth. There is a reason why it has been the subject of so many sermons, and as a matter of fact, it was a sermon I listened to a few weeks ago that got me thinking upon this parable in a different way, one I'd never considered before, and that is the role of the storyteller in the story. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. I'm sure that it could go without saying, but as we go through this parable, keep in the back of your minds that the Father that we're reading about represents God the Father. It'll be helpful. In chapter 15, in verses 1 and 2, we get the setting of what is going on. Now the tax collectors and sinners are all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So Jesus tells them three parables, of which the parable of the prodigal son is third. You will recall that the parable begins with the father's youngest son coming to him and asking him for his inheritance. Now, for the youngest son, this would have been a third of the father's estate. And it was common for the son to wait until the father's passing before he received his inheritance, but this son is not patient enough for that. And he comes to his father now and says, I want my inheritance. And the father complied. Picking up in verse 11 of chapter 15. And he said, there was a man who had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me." And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into the far country. I'm going to hold here for just a moment. Notice as this was not the temper tantrum of a small child who takes a shirt and a box of Pop-Tarts, stuffs them into a backpack, and then announces to the family, "I'm running away from home." This is an older son that comes to this conclusion. He was of such an age that when he requested his inheritance be released to him, his father went along with it and did not try to prevent him from leaving. This is a plan that he would have had in his mind for some time. It was not capricious. It was not reactionary. It was something that he would have longed for and dreamed about. And now that his father had released the inheritance to him, there was nothing standing between him and that far country. In verse 13, we read that he had gathered all that he had. This is because he was not planning on coming back, at least not anytime soon. Within a few days, sets out with money, possessions, hope, the strength of youth, to, in today's vernacular, follow his heart, or to live his best life. And with what I imagine to be a light heart and a spring in his step, he makes his way down the long road that led away from his father's home. And what we know about the father, he would have been standing there watching. In all of this that has transpired, the son showed no evidence of concern or consideration for his father or the relationship that he had had with him. He has turned his back on his father, on his love, his counsel, and I think especially his father's authority over him. All in pursuit of the kind of satisfaction that the writer of Ecclesiastes spends so many pages warning about. A.T. Robertson comments, he had burned all of his bridges. Now, if we look forward a few words in verse 13 and maybe a few months, we find the son broke, alone, desperate, famished, filthy, and in the company of pigs, which for a Jew was a particularly sharp humiliation. Picking up in verse 13, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into the far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. And he was longing to be fed the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. And continuing in verse 17, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Finally, in verse 10, we read, when he came to himself. Hitting rock bottom does that. It has a way of jarring loose the nonsense in our heads, and we can begin to see things as they really are, and even see ourselves for who we really are. This young man had lost all that his father had given him, and assumed that in the process that he had lost his father as well. Realization turns into determination, and he commits to returning home and even recites what he will say to his father when he arrives. Father, I have sinned. The hardest words would come first. Against heaven and before you, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Considering what he had done and in the manner with which he had done it, it was the best scenario he could imagine. And even then, he was relying heavily upon his father's mercy. He had hoped for no more of this, no more than this. As we come to this reunion, remember that Jesus knew his Father better than anyone did. He was one with him. He had spent eternity with him. And this is what Jesus wants those who are gathered about him and us this morning to know about his Father's love. In verse 20, and he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion on him, and ran and embraced and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. His father saw him a long way off because he was looking for him. Upon seeing the boy, the father's first and overwhelming response was compassion. So he ran, embraced, and kissed. In the Greek, it says he kissed him again and again and again. Someone noted that at this time and in this culture, and especially at the father's age, to run was just unheard of. It just wasn't done. It was terribly undignified. It required pulling up his robe and tucking it into the sash around his waist, exposing his legs. And then there was just the act of running itself. It was far beneath the patriarch of a household, a man who was respected. And yet he ran. How great the Father's love. When you have liked to been there to see the expression on this young man's face as his father ran to him, his arms stretched out, wanting to embrace him. Think about it. On the long journey home, the boy would have spent a lot of time thinking about various scenarios as to what this reunion with his father might be like. It was a long journey. But his imagination would never have conjured up such a reception as this. Because the young man knew that he had left his father home with much, an inheritance, all the things that he had gathered, and now he returns with nothing, hungry, filthy, and smelling of pigs. And then there was the manner in which he left. I don't think he would have been surprised if the reunion went something a little more like this. When he confronts his father, "Boy, what have you done? Where is all that I gave you? Where are all the things that you took with you? And look at you. Do you have any idea what you have put me through?" You see, the son did not anticipate this loving welcome that he did receive because it was not consistent with the father that he knew. Yes, the father loved him deeply, but his father was also a righteous and a just man, and he had never known his father to overlook sin. And by his own confession, he had sinned against heaven and before his father. Later in the story, when the older son returns from the fields and he comes and he hears the music and somebody tells him what's going on, he's indignant to find celebration in place of punishment. The complete absence of justice and all that was going on. How can this be happening? And remember, the father in the parable represents God, and we know our Heavenly Father to be holy and just, unwilling, incapable even of overlooking sin. How then can what Jesus is sharing in this parable be true? To understand, we have to consider the role of the storyteller in the story. You see, Jesus is essential to the story. He is key to the outcome of the story, how it ends. Jesus had known from eternity that God required a sacrifice, and a sacrifice required a lamb, and he was to be that lamb. Remember how John the Baptist introduced Jesus. "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." That which separated us from our Father and the love he desperately wants to show us. Even as he tells it, Jesus knew that without his sacrifice, the parable does not ring true. Without his death on the cross, there is no joyful reunion. There is no running, no embracing, no kissing. His death is how God can be both just and the justifier of those who have sinned against him. The father says about his boy, "For this is my son. He was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Verse 24, and again to his oldest son, he says the same thing in verse 32. Jesus tells this parable as he's on his way to Jerusalem for the last time. Luke records in chapter 9 and 51, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. All the while that he shares this parable, somewhere in his mind there has to be the understanding that the cross is not far off. The understanding of what his role in the story demands. Those gathered around him did not know the role Jesus was going to play, but we do. We know that Jesus went to the cross where he suffered and died so that we may be called the children of God.